so thank you for coming. I'm here to talk about building an intuitive admin experience for your site. And as I mentioned, we can try and apply that. My goal in making this presentation was to help encourage people and teach people about the topic that I found it was often ignored, and teaching concepts so that we can all make informed decisions throughout the process, and using some of that information and understanding to actually drive some of those decisions even after it's been completed, or just setting priorities. So that's been one of my goals with this presentation. Another one of my goals has been making it go to the next slide. So I'm Stefan Lucero. I'm the Director of Engineering and DevOps at Forum 1. And I've worked with Drupal since the Drupal 7 launch party. And since then, I've worked mostly in an agency environment. One of the things that's really enabled me to do is work with a lot of people focused on different roles and coming from different disciplines. And one of my favorite things about that has been working with people that are very passionate about their individual disciplines and very qualified for what they do. So by doing that, I've been able to pick up different perspectives and the important questions that they're asking and processes, so that I can try and incorporate those into the things that I'm completing. And hopefully I can help to convey some of that to you. That's why, as a back-end developer, I'm here talking about admin UX, which is not typically a topic my discipline would speak to. But before we get started, a quick note on Forum 1. Forum 1 is a mission-driven digital agency, so our goal is to partner with organizations and government agencies to help them achieve their goals, and we want to help by doing that by creating an impactful digital experience for them to just help achieve their mission and be successful overall. These are a handful of our clients that we've worked with, among many others, and they just, as you can see, a lot of them have clear goals or missions to help with things, and that's what our passions are about. So before we get started, we're going to talk about admin UX, but we should probably actually answer, what is admin UX? Usability.gov has their definition here, but to walk through it, UX stands for user experience, and they define it as improving the quality of the user's interaction and perceptions of the product and the related services with it. A lot of the user experience, this is before we even get into the administrative side, this is just user experience with any tools or web applications or literally anything else that you work with. And this breaks down a bit to reviewing the experience of a product. So general interactions, usage, even just kind of gut impressions that you take away from your experience working with a product. And this varies based on the user, since the goals and tasks of every user vary. One of the important parts of user experience study is identifying the types of users that you have, building user personas, and that's an important piece of it, so you understand who you're building for, what you're trying to accomplish. And this most commonly is focused on the end user of a site, so the site visitors that are going to be coming and using and seeing the front end of a website. And so that's where all of the focus is usually put whenever there's actually user experience emphasis put on a project. But there's another end user that is frequently forgotten. And so they're not our only end user. Front end users aren't the only end users. So first, who are we thinking is the most frequently returning users on a site? Over the lifespan of a site, we're going to have visitors. There's going to be visitors that love our site and come really frequently. But who are the people that are going to come all the time to the site? Not because of their interests, but because it's their job. And who spends the most time on the site? Somebody might come frequently and read the articles or just do whatever we've built for it. But the people that have to log in and manage the site, the site administrators, and the content editors, these are the audience that is often forgotten and we need to focus on as well. It's important that we address their experience. So swinging back to what is admin UX? we're applying all of the same processes for site administrators, all the same UX focuses, identifying what their tasks are, their roles, and a lot of the stuff that we do throughout the build process, like even looking at permissioning, where we're building user roles for that. A lot of that is already part of what we can leverage on the UX process for admin users. And the goal is to identify these roles and streamline the tasks that they have to complete on a regular basis. And this helps to increase the confidence and success with the system and improve their perception of the system. So just as important as end users looking at your site or your brand and the way that they think about it, the impression they take away from it, editors and administrators have the same biases and the same takeaways from their sites. So whatever you have to log into and use on a daily basis, there's that same kind of bias and takeaways from it. So, I mean, if you think about systems that you've used on a regular basis and like focusing on maybe some outdated or like, for example, an outdated banking website, you log in and maybe it's in like HTML tables and it's just like this painful experience to find everything that you want to do. It's really slow. Another one, like I find commonly utility websites, so like the electric company or the gas company, that their focus isn't the web presence, but these are just user-facing sites that you have to log in and manage things, and it's not intuitive. I know myself, some of those, like I dread going to those websites every month because it's inconvenient, and even if it works fine, like that interface, like it's outdated and I don't have a lot of confidence that it's going to work well. So the goal on admin UX is that we're going to help the user succeed and know what to expect from their experience. But one of the topics there around it is, why is admin UX important? I expect a lot of you might already have some ideas and thoughts about why it's important since you came here today. But it's also important because, like, let's think about this experience. So if you'll hear me, raise your hand if you've encountered any of these situations before. So, all right, we've all seen a typo on a page, right? But you try and fix it, and it might take you more than 5 minutes to actually fix it. Has that ever happened to anybody? Like, trying to find just a typo, just trying to fix the spelling of a word. How about you open the edit form for the first time, and just as it loads, you feel that moment of fear just with the amount of form inputs. So like it loads up the page and there's just an overwhelming amount of stuff to fill in. How about, this one's always interesting to get feedback on. You've seen an issue on a page. Maybe it's that same typo in the content, but you pretend you didn't see it. I didn't see that. Last time it was hard to fix it, so I didn't see it now, and we're just going to pretend it didn't happen. And I'm still looking for somebody like that. Has anybody tried to work on a node edit form and their scroll wheel broke before you got to the bottom of it? Drupal's notorious for that long edit form if it's not organized. Just throughout the life of the project, we're just adding more and more fields, and they all just go after each other. So those should make you think of reasons that admin UX is important. A lot of times we don't think of the admin experience, but those types of situations are good examples of the admin experience. And some symptoms, like you may have a poor admin experience on your site and not know it. So these are some symptoms of a poor admin experience. For your users, is there a lot of confusion or frustration or just general dissatisfaction from your editors? Are they not sure how to do things, or even if they are doing it right, they're not confident in how to do it? Even after they've completed the work and worked on their content, is it broken? Or is it not behaving the way that they expected? Did they misunderstand what the goal of the page was and the goal of the feature was? And just the most common one is talking to your editors or talking to your clients or whoever's using the site. Is there generally a lack of confidence in how to use the site? Do they feel like they know how to do everything? Do they say that they do, but it's always with that kind of tone, like, yeah, I can do that. Like those are all symptoms of a poor admin UX that needs some attention. So probably the reason everybody's here today is how do we make a great admin experience? That's what we all want for our sites. We want all of our users to say it's great. We don't really have enough time to go through everything to make it great. So let's focus on making it better. There's already a lot of smart people very active and working hard on core to identify ways to improve it. There's very exciting core initiatives rebuilding the editorial experience, and those are going to be awesome when they come out. And if you want to follow it, I think I've got links later in the slideshow to go and check those out, and especially if you want to get involved. That's all great. But we don't have to wait that long for our sites to have a better admin experience. There are things that we can do right now or on our projects coming up throughout the life of our projects to make that better. But so how do we get here? How do we get to a site with a poor admin experience? And a lot of it is most commonly the priority is focused on the front end design rather than information architecture. So as part of that, the admin experience ends up as just a byproduct of what the front end design looks like. A lot of times the home page or just a single design of one page, whatever that user experience on the front end is going to be. And site builders or developers, just as part of the process, we build it however it needs to be to make that happen on the front end. But there's not a consideration for how does the editor maintain that? How do they get involved, and how do they change content? Is it obvious? Is it easy? And that's not a question that's always asked. Another problem with it is just a difference in perspective. So it's really common that the people using the site, building the site, it's an entirely separate team of people than the people that are actually going to be maintaining it long term. So like the site editors, site administrators, it's really frequent that they'll come to a development agency, ask for it to be built, and then never look at it until it's time for them to get trained and work with it. And if that's a kind of process that you have, it's not ideal because you're not getting that input from that audience. Ideally, you can have them more actively involved, get that feedback, or even if it's kind of a detached process like that, work with them ahead of time and try and get their understand what their processes are going to be. The same type of effort on the front end where you're focused on making it obvious and easy for the users to go to that call to action or accomplish whatever it is you're wanting them to do. Do that same kind of research with your administrators and your editors. But this difference in perspective, developers are more familiar with Drupal. So like the really weird things that Drupal does, like have to go through 3 menus deep to actually like add a new node or something like that. Like looking for, like I need new tags. So I need to go through like taxonomy, vocabularies, pick out which specific one, and those aren't even always named easily. So like those are things that Drupal developers have been doing for years and they're comfortable with, and it's just the way it is. But new editors, like if they're coming from another CMS or they had a previous one, they're not familiar with that. They don't have that background experience, and they shouldn't have to learn how to build Drupal just to edit their site. So let's focus on making it easier for them. Site builders are always focused on making the functionality work instead of how it's going to work. So especially when the focus is on building to a design, the focus is trying to, what structure do I need to make it happen, and not what the information architecture is. That often gets lost along the way, and that's one way that we get to a poor admin experience. And then one of the biggest culprits and reasons that poor admin experiences get through to the finish line is that site builders and developers often actually avoid entering content. It's viewed as just this painful task or this like repetitive drudgery that we don't want to do. So look at the reason that it is a painful or repetitive or just inconvenient task. That itself is a symptom of a problem, because like if the developers, the people building the site and intimately familiar with it, don't like putting in the content or have trouble getting it right every time, that's a big red flag that something needs to be done about it. So some of the excuses that lead to this and just a spoiler, none of these are true. But I've got points for all of them about like why it's not quite the same. So one of the most common is that it's less valuable than front-end features. This goes back to the same point about the focus on design. Like one of the really frequent things is like, okay, we're getting a new site. What does the home page look like? And that's never a good example because that's always a unique design that's entirely separate from the rest of the site. And so that always puts us in a focus on what the design looks like rather than what the experience is going to be. So focusing on the content model, the content infrastructure leads to a better and more intuitive editorial experience. So it's in no way less valuable than the front-end experience because in some ways it's more valuable because you're focusing on the actual like information architecture for it that's going to continue to live with your site, often after you move off of Drupal because you have to migrate the content out of that structure. There's not enough time, so maybe it takes too long to build any of it. And some of the stuff that I'm going to cover in this presentation is a focus on ways that you can build and improve the process during the tasks that you're already doing. So it doesn't necessarily add a whole bunch of time. It doesn't even have to be a separate task in the build process. If we're understanding what the goals are for an admin process or admin experience, then we can make decisions as we add fields. So like when you add a new field, where should it go on the form? Actually configure that during that process rather than just, I created a field and it landed at the bottom automatically. So just think about what groups need to be there in what order, where it makes sense. And another excuse is that it's too expensive. This ties pretty closely to not enough time, but so if I'm talking about not having to spend a whole lot of time doing it, it works into what we're already doing. That cuts that somewhat short. But another one is like questions about there's not enough time or it's too expensive to do research on these admin roles or personas. But again, like I mentioned earlier, like user personas, like we're already doing research on some of that for like the user roles, identifying what type of permissions they're going to have, what are the main sections within the site, who's managing what. There's a lot of stuff that we're already doing for the functionality of the site that can be entirely repurposed as long as we know to do it and actually think about the admin experience along the way. So some solutions that I've kind of focused on so far is as people that are actually interested in this, and even for the people that aren't here, that like it's helpful to learn some UX basics so that we're aware of things and can actually identify things that can be improved. Even if we don't know how to fix it, the first step is identifying what the issue is. So with some basics in UX, and we're gonna kind of run through some of those, and hopefully you'll leave today with a little bit of understanding of that. Then it's a lot easier to make decisions as you go without adding any cost or adding any time or extra tasks or extra work or extra people to the project. Along that thought, like building as you go. So rather than coming back at the end and trying to reorganize all the fields, if you're adding a field or you're updating the way the form is displayed or anything like that, these are things that we do countless times throughout the build of a project. Actually just place that field where it goes. Spend a second, think about what makes sense for it to be next to, or what would help text be that would tell what the goal of it is, and actually configure that along the way. If we're all thinking about that as we go, it doesn't have to be a separate task or this gargantuan effort to organize and coordinate all of it. And one of the things that helps to support these is using contrib modules. In this room, we're not the only people talking about admin UX. So there's a huge community effort, and there's a lot of contrib modules that are available so that we can actually do these things without even a bit of custom code. We just enable the module, configure things as we go, and it takes care of it for us. So I'm going to have links to a number of modules in this presentation. I encourage you to download the slides later, and you'll be able to actually go through and check the links, and hopefully you'll find some things that will be helpful for you. But I keep talking a lot, so let's actually dive into the UX crash course and kind of run through some of those things that are helpful to learn. Some common pitfalls that lead to that poor admin experience. These are important things to identify and try to avoid. So we've got really long forms, those notoriously long node edit forms or anything else that just aren't organized. Speaking of organization, there's no order to it. There's no thought or like grouping of fields or anything. The labeling might be unclear. So like, oh, there's a checkbox, but I don't really know what that does. There's no help text. It'd be helpful if that checkbox had help text to actually describe to you what it does. One of the worst things is misleading help text. I would say that's probably worse than no help text at all, because that sets an expectation for the user that it's going to do one thing and then entirely breaks that promise. So when we add help text or labeling, it's important to keep in mind that if that changes, we need to actually update that. And if there's too much information. So we want to avoid having too much information and overwhelming the user. We just want to keep things concise, but having enough information to guide them and help them understand. So we're going to run through a few guiding principles, and each step of the way I'm going to try and give you some examples to benefit from it and some modules that would be helpful as well. Our first one is hierarchy. It's all about guiding the users through the experience and giving them a clear indication of relationships with the content. So just because we're not doing this huge design, we're focused on forms that are going to look a lot of the same. That's not necessarily a bad thing. The important thing is that we organize them in a way that we can have a clear hierarchy and describe the relationships between fields. So some of the key things to support that is organization is key. Use proximity to define relationships. We intuitively identify that like a field next to another field should be somewhat related in some way to it. And group related fields logically. So like for example, think about date fields. You don't want to have a date being entered and you have 3 separate fields where it's like month, day, year, but maybe they're not next to each other. Even if they are next to each other, maybe they're not concisely grouped with each other. Having a group around that to clearly indicate it is a good example of one thing that just defines clear hierarchy very well. And convey that organization with clear labels. So again, for that date example, like we have the month, day, and the year, but if we group it, it can be helpful to have a clear label on it and say, what is that date for? So for example, if we're doing an event and start date, end date, those are very different, but the fields look the same. Make sure your labels are clear and clearly explain what those are. We want to use containers and tabs to visually separate elements. And those are also great tools for actually guiding users through the experience and guiding them in how to configure the content. So don't think beyond just that vertical scroll in guiding the users through things. We can prioritize things, put things in front of them, and let them focus where they need to, rather than just having to scroll from top to bottom of the page. Some of our most basic tools for this are field sets and details, as they're called in Drupal 8. And they let you group things logically, like I've described. They also let you define just clear semantic relationships, so just show the meaning of content between fields. So we can focus on meaningful data relationships, like components of a date field. Details, visually, the detail fields are the ones that can collapse. They have a label on top of them. And use those to separate groups of elements and keep similar fields independent from other groups. So using the start and end date example, you don't want those blended together because they're very similar. But if you set a group, like a border around them, that clearly defines what group they belong to and that they're separate. So using groups helps you to find clear boundaries on where the focus of things are and where they extend to and where they don't. And labels help to define those relationships as well. And one important thing about field sets and details is they also give you a vehicle to add more help text. So if you have a really complex or really confusing set of fields, and maybe they all work together, but you have there's no way to clearly describe how they all work together on each individual field. A group is a great way to add that. You can add a group around it, give a clear, concise label, and you can add help text on those to describe how they all work together and what the goal is. Horizontal tabs are another thing that's added using field groups. And the important thing to note here is the direction that tabs are following. So these are going from left to right in our typical languages. Some sites go right to left. So just keep in mind which direction that's going, what your editor is going to be familiar with. But the important thing here is that's the direction it expands. So keep your titles short. Long titles are going to blow that up, and you especially don't want it breaking to multiple lines, because that just breaks the interface and it's confusing. For the same reason, avoid too many tabs, and don't let the tab become too tall for the screen. The tabs actually drive and they anchor the experience for the user. So if you have to scroll really far to the bottom of a tab and you've lost the horizontal tabs at the top, then you're going to lose your context, and you get to the bottom there, you're going to forget there's more tabs to click through. So if you're seeing fields that are commonly ignored and lost, that could be one of the reasons why. They're having to scroll past it and losing that context to indicate there's more to see. Even if you don't expand beyond the screen, then there's just as much likelihood that content can be skipped if we're not paying attention. Just go from one tab to the next or scroll through. So don't hide very important content in tabs beyond the first one. So one way to think of it is skippable content. So it's nice to have this content, but you shouldn't tuck required fields behind a tab, because those are likely to get lost and be confusing. And don't nest tabs. The same way I described is that anchoring the experience and guiding the progress. If you have nested tabs, it's especially confusing, and then it's really overwhelming when you have a set of 5 tabs, and then in one of those you have another set of 5 tabs. When you started, you didn't expect to have to fill out that much content. Very similar to horizontal tabs or vertical tabs, and you can use them all the same way. The main difference is that they're top to bottom instead of left to right, but these expand more easily if you have more tabs. So like if you have too many tabs for left to right, or the title's too long, vertical tabs might be a good option. And if you have a set of tabs that you expect to continue growing over the life of a site, adding more features, vertical tabs expand much more easily in a predictable way. So you're not capping how many there can be. But at the same time, don't let it get too tall. You don't want these to expand beyond the height of the screen. And again, don't nest them, because especially with vertical tabs, you have horizontal spacing issues that are very painful. And with both types of tabs, limit one set of them per page, because it can be confusing going from one group to the next, and especially like asking for help, trying to describe, like, no, not the first set of tabs, the third tab in the second set. Like, stuff like that gets really confusing. So try and keep it as simple as possible.
Excuse me, what do you mean limit one set? Can you expand on that?
So the question was to explain, like, limiting one set per page. So, for example, you don't necessarily want to have one set of horizontal tabs and then right below it have another set of horizontal tabs. They're great for grouping content together and kind of guiding users through what they need to complete. But if you're having multiple things to step through, it's confusing to have an entirely separately managed one to step through again. So these are a few modules to build a hierarchy. Field group is the main one that I've been describing here, but more on the information architecture side. There's paragraphs, entity construction kit, and inline entity form. All of these are helpful for actually describing and managing this hierarchy and that experience for how people are creating and managing content. Our next point is consistency. And consistency is a great tool to build familiarity and comfort with a system. So when building your admin interface, you want to stay consistent. Thinking about, like, we've got a lot of the same types of forms, but you're going through different places. So like every node edit form has a title. Some node edit forms might have tags. You're reusing the same type of data between content types. And if you're actually doing that, actually reuse the content, reuse the fields, so that you're maintaining that experience between all places. And that goes to the first point of keeping your interactions as consistent as possible. You want to maintain, like if you define a pattern for how content's entered, don't change that elsewhere, because it's very jarring and it's hard to follow. You think, like more often than not, when the user comes to a different experience like that for the same content, they're going to think they broke it, or it's just they're not doing something right, and they're going to start having a lack of confidence or understanding in how to manage the system. So establish and reuse those patterns. So if you have the same set of fields, like a common one is like metadata or like teaser fields, things like that that are going to be the same across a bunch of content types, reuse those exact fields and that exact pattern across all of them. And maintain the same widgets for the same type of data. So, for example, if you're using, for taxonomy terms, if you're using autocomplete in one place, as long as it makes sense, then use it in other places as well. So, like, don't make people get used to auto-completing in one place, but having a drop down to select from a long list of tags in another, because they're going to be confused as to, like, it would be so much easier if I could just do a drop down here like I did on the other one, and that just becomes a common frustration on the interface across all of them. A few tools to help build these consistently. This is mostly, like, these don't really help on the end user experience, but throughout the build process they're invaluable. So field tools is a way to actually clone, if you're using the same fields between different node types, that gives you a capacity to clone those fields. So rather than hoping to, like, in one tab you're creating those and in another you're creating them the same way, this will actually clone them and keep it consistent for you. These other ones are mostly reports that display data across the configuration in Drupal, so it consolidates in one place so you can see if everything's consistent. So for example, help text or labels or anything like that, this pulls it all together between content types so you can see, like, oh, well, I changed the wording around here or something like that, and make them all consistent. Our next principle is simplicity, and complexity is the enemy of usability. So we want things to be easy and obvious, and keeping things simple is the best way to do that. Somewhat counterintuitively, though, simplicity is often the hardest thing to accomplish, because everybody wants more features, and that involves more data, more configuration, and that makes the back-end interface more complex. So a lot of times we have to stop and really evaluate what really needs to be here, or what can I get rid of, and simplify it so that users don't see too much information. So we work hard to make sites, and users shouldn't have to work hard to use it. So provide thoughtful default values whenever possible. So if they don't actually have to enter anything in the field, don't make them. If it's the same value 90% of the time, put that in there, and then they can change it on the occasion that they actually need to. One important note on that is actually confirm what that default value is. Don't make an assumption, so you're not putting that 10% value, so they have to change it every time. Also, you want to auto-populate or update fields. So if there's a case where, like, when I check this checkbox, this should always be checked. Automate that. Don't make them remember every time, or get used to this scenario where, okay, every time the page looks broken like this, that means I've got to go and check this box. Make that intuitive and automate it if you can. And one helpful module to do that is conditional fields. That's a great way to just automate that without any custom code. If a user role doesn't need to see it, it shouldn't be there. So there's so many, like, editors might have so much information, so many checkboxes and things to toggle, but they've just been told, like, no, you shouldn't edit that. You shouldn't see that, don't click that. That makes them very hesitant to use the system, very cautious and nervous, like, I hope I don't click the wrong thing, and there's not a lot of confidence there. So if there's role-specific customizations you can do to hide things, then actually hide them. A step beyond that, if it doesn't serve a purpose, hide it. So that one checkbox that we had early in the build to make sure, like, yeah, that was migrated, or this was updated and edited, then eventually that's going to be forgotten. Like, what does that even mean? And like your editors are going to ask, like, well, why do I have to check that? Well, I don't know. We just always check it. Make sure you do, because it might break. And that's a common thing I've heard. So just like whenever you change functionality, if that doesn't do anything, or even if it's always got to have a checked value, and the use case doesn't exist anymore for it to be unchecked, set that and hide it. Don't make users remember an experience that they don't have to anymore. These are a few modules that will help you simplify things. But each one of them has different applications for it, so I'd encourage you to kind of click through them and look at what their behaviors are. And the more familiar you are with the tools that are available, the more you'll see kind of how you can use them to simplify the website for it. We want to keep things intuitive, and this is probably our most nebulous concept, which makes it a bit hard. But one of the ways to do that is we want to speak the user's language. So whenever they're looking, however they refer to the site is how we should refer to it in the interface. Drupal by necessity uses these really vague terms because it's a content management framework rather than a content management system. It's being used to build whatever experience we want it to be. And that's what we love about it. But that's also why we have these terms like nodes, content types, paragraphs. They by themselves, they don't really mean anything. And our individual sites that we're building for clients or for projects, they don't have that same requirement. They're not supporting every possible site that could be built. They're talking to this individual audience. So use those words. Like if they call it an article or they call it a post, name it that. It doesn't have to be whatever you call it internally. And we want to establish, another way is to leverage established patterns for common interfaces. So looking at look at the rest of the internet, and we all use the internet all the time, so we're familiar with different ways that we have to configure things. A common one's the date field. It's pretty standard to use a date picker. Like click it, here's the calendar, and you can click through it. That's just one example, but if you're entering dates in there, do that. That's the common expectation for users. And look at other things like auto-completion or tagging, just things that users might see elsewhere and they'll automatically expect when they're entering that type of content on their site. So leverage that familiarity elsewhere and maintain that pattern. You also want to use the most helpful widgets for the data being entered. So for example, for a date field, you want that date picker. You don't want just an open text field, and even if you have help text, like this is the format that it should be. Don't make them concentrate on doing the format every time. If it's structured data, provide a way for them to do that. So depending what type of content you're looking into, look on Drupal.org. There are so many modules that just add some kind of widget for a specific type of field, and you can make it more intuitive for them to use it without even having to write your own functionality. And speaking back to hierarchy, group your information together sensibly. You want to think about the order that information is being entered. So, for example, if the body content is the focus of the page, then have that prioritized early. Slideshow images, if that's what they're creating is a slideshow, then prioritize entering those images. That's what their focus is when they're coming there. Let them do that first. But one of the things that's kind of an exception to that is the title. You almost always want to have the title for the content first, because that's almost the unique identifier for the page as far as the editor is concerned. That kind of anchors the page and sets the tone for it for what they're working on each time. And a few modules to help with this intuition these are mostly just different widget interfaces. And these are just common examples and definitely not an exhaustive list. So look through Drupal.org and find modules that enter and manage the type of data that you're looking for. One of the ones I do like to call out on here, though, is custom add another. It's the last one in the list there. We've always seen anytime there's unlimited value fields, there's always that add another button, especially with paragraphs. I've always seen where sometimes it'll get nested and you have this nest of add another buttons. what do those actually mean? Like, do you know for sure that this one is adding another of the second level of paragraph versus like the inside one? Custom add another is a great module where you can just configure that field and say exactly what that button should say. So add another slide, add another image, add another date, any of those. It takes 2 seconds to configure, and it's invaluable to the end user. We also want to be helpful, because a helpful interface is much more valuable than a helpful support line. So if they understand the interface naturally, then they don't have to call and ask for support. They don't have to get frustrated. They don't have to break things if we make it intuitive and help them to be successful. So you want to guide the user through the process. Some of the most helpful ways to do this are using clear labels and helpful notes for your fields and your groups. And speaking of groups, add them so that your help text, a lot of times if you've just grouped content, you don't need labels, you don't need help text, because it makes sense that it's all in proximity to each other and you understand what that relationship is. But you also want to make sure and describe what the system expects. So talking about like the date format, if that's how you're entering data, then they need to understand what the format's going to be for that. So you describe what the system expects. But also you need to focus on and explain what the user should expect. So if I click this, what's going to happen? Nobody likes that big red button and not really knowing what's going to happen for it. So try and give some explanation of what it's going to be. This checkbox makes the page actually show the header, or this one hides it. So just explain what your stuff does and what they should expect by doing that. This is all part of helping the user succeed and making their job easier. So this is part of an intuitive admin experience. These are a few of the important modules to help with that, and one I'll call out here that I feel is like everybody was really excited about it with Drupal 8, but then nobody uses it, and that's the tour module. It's built into core. It gives you this kind of guided tour of everything on the site. You can configure like all the help text, and it's living documentation that's extremely friendly, helpful for people to use, and way more accessible than some document, some PDF somewhere that they have to dig out through Google Drive that they received 3 years ago to try and train somebody how to use it. If it's right there on the website, then they can walk through everything. And a great example I've seen of that is the Thunder distribution. So if you install the Thunder distribution locally, start it up, then they actually have Tour pop up and offer to walk you through the whole process. So I would encourage you to try and spin that up and actually like walk through and see what Tour is capable of and implement it when implemented well. So as we wrap up, we've got some resources for you to be aware of. If you want to learn more, there's a lot of the content that I've covered, especially on the different types of widgets, is documented very well and very thoroughly in the Drupal user interface standards, and the link is right there. I would encourage you to check it out. Even if you're not familiar with UX or don't have a lot of experience with it, they break it down very well and give you clear bullet points on use this widget here, use this widget then, avoid this. And just that step will progress your knowledge a lot further. And again, you don't have to be a site builder to benefit from that. If you're a project manager or an editor or a designer, just if you have to use the site at all, being aware of these things are how we can help educate others and help them to build better websites along the way. Like, hey, it'd be easier if you configured it like this, or we could change that. And that's how we learn and improve overall. Usability.gov is another excellent resource for it. I've got a link here to the current core initiative for adding and improving the admin UX. So they're rebuilding the entire node edit form, and it looks awesome. I encourage you to check it out and see what's happening there. And then there's a handful of distributions that are focused on this, both for building more efficiently, but also like a lot of these admin experiences are things that do get forgotten on all the projects. So build it into the base distribution for it so that every site benefits from it. So these are a handful that are worth checking out as well. Thank you. We're right at time, but I can take a couple of questions or I can chat with people afterwards if there's anything.
As a content admin, I just want to make the comment that one of the best things a developer can do is talk to your content admin while you're building. Like, they'll just build something and then go let them use it. But like, when a developer comes to me midway through the process and wants to understand my workflow or what I do first, the tasks I need to complete to post a blog post or whatever, that's just so valuable, and it saves all this back and forth later once the site's actually up and running and having to go back and fix things. So it's a great team building thing too, so talk to your content admins.
Just for the video, that was as a content admin, you want to actually, it's great when the developers actually talk to you. And correct me if I'm missing anything like major, but it's great to talk to the developers and so that they can really understand the workflow. And that's how we flesh out what we need during the process. Yep.
Where can we get your slides?
I'm hoping that I'll be able to post them on the page for Drupal.org, or on the Badcamp presentation page, and I'll post those probably this evening. And there are, for the slides, there are a lot of links and everything through it and all the modules and everything, so I would encourage at least checking them out. Sir?
There's some really useful kind of contrib modules out there that have really great functionality, but then they kind of have these really terrible admin interfaces. Is there any initiative to kind of like go through the like heavily used contrib modules and kind of assist those module developers to kind of standardize
the
admin across the whole of Drupal?
So the question was, is there an initiative to help contrib modules standardize and improve their user interfaces? The UX guidelines, the Drupal user interface guidelines, that's mostly what that is. It's kind of buried, which is why I wanted to make sure and provide the link, but that's one of the best tools that's provided for contrib authors to actually be aware of how those widgets and how the form structures are intended to be used. So the idea is hopefully that we can all be educated and make good decisions for it. I'm not aware of any kind of concerted effort to organize and like bring all of them together or many of them together, but what I would encourage is just a common community effort. So if there's even if you don't have a clear answer or solution for making a contrib module's interface better, like some constructive thought on like this is what was really confusing on it. Like as an editor, I was confused on where to add this, or I couldn't find the editorial page. That's one way to first identify the problem so that the conversation can start on working on improving it. And if you're a developer or can take a more active role in it, feel free to do patches, or a designer, you can just mock up designs and like suggest alternative workflows for it. So just keep that kind of community experience and participate and use the issue queue to encourage improvement on it. Anybody else? All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.